When did your girlfriend's parents realize they were wrong for treating you like trash? After they found out I was secretly wealthy. My girlfriend Nora had warned me on the phone that morning. Look, my parents can be difficult, but I talked to them, and they promised to be on their best behavior tonight. I smiled. It's cute when you worry, but I got this. I spent 4 hours making my family's cinnamon apple pie. They say the best way to a person's heart is through their stomach, I told her confidently. But in the Uber to their estate, I was nervous as heck. My hands were shaking when I knocked on their door. Her dad opened it and looked me up and down like I was a salesperson. You must be Aaron, he said. It's Adam. Yes, it's so nice to meet you. His eyes landed on the wine and apple pie in my hands. He fought back a disgusted look. Is this from Trader Joe's? Yes, I said. It's actually my favorite. It's a little bit pricey, but oh, this wine is pricey for you? He asked, giggling. He set the wine down beside the trash can and led me to the dining room. At dinner, her mom didn't wait long. So, what do you do for work? Nora mentioned something about volunteering. I'm between positions right now, I replied. Between positions, her dad repeated to her brother. That's what they call unemployed now. Her brother laughed. I love your suit. So vintage. Where did you find it, Goodwill? I glanced down at my navy suit and smiled gently. It was my father's, actually. Of course it was, her dad said. He turned to Nora. Remember when you dated Marcus? Now he had style. Actual designer style. Nora frowned, shifting in her seat uncomfortably. Guys, can we not do this tonight? I'm just saying, her dad interrupted. Some men are raised with class. It's not something you can learn. After dinner, while everyone moved to the living room, her dad stopped me and smiled, pointing at the table. You don't mind, do you? I started clearing plates while they sat on the couches, laughing. Nora stood up to help, but her dad pulled her back down. Don't be silly. He's fine. Consider it house husband practice. Her brother-in-law walked over and dropped his wine glass into the sink while I was washing, splashing soapy water on my shirt. You missed a spot on that plate. My housekeeper would have been fired for that. Her dad came into the kitchen and stood uncomfortably close while I scrubbed the last few dishes. Adam, right? We need to discuss something. Our family requires prenups, ironclad ones. You understand why, don't you? Some men see our Nora as a meal ticket, but not Marcus. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of Nora with a striking man in a suit and tie at a formal event. I never really understood why she ended things with him. I heard he's a federal prosecutor now, a guy with real ambition. Oh, but don't worry. It's lovely. You're so great at cleaning. It might get you somewhere too, he added. That's when Nora walked into the kitchen and snatched the phone from his hands, deleting the photo. Can you all just quit messing with Adam and give him a chance? Her dad rolled his eyes. Can't you see? We just don't like him. He doesn't fit with the family. The poor marry the poor, and the rich marry the rich. That's how it's always been and always will be. The entire family started yelling at each other, with Nora calling them shallow and them calling me a waste of space and a gold digger. Then the doorbell rang, making everyone in the room freeze. A man in a $3,000 suit rushed in and pulled me to the side. Adam, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but the board is in an emergency session and won't proceed without you. The deal with the Tokyo company is on the line. He held up an iPad showing a video call with 20 people in a boardroom. I dried my hands. How much are they demanding? I took the iPad, scanning the contracts while Nora's entire family watched in silence. That's 400 million over market. Tell Yamamoto 1.9 or we walk. While I spoke to the board, Nora's mom laughed. This is a prank, right? To make you look good in front of us. The man who had rushed in glared at her mother and asked them to remain silent. 1 second, I told the board, and looked at the family. This isn't a prank. I said I was between positions. I'm transitioning from CEO to chairman. My father's retiring. But you shop at Trader Joe's, her dad argued. I own shares of Trader Joe's if that counts. Oh, and the wine you threw away. That was actually a $3,000 bottle from my family's vineyard in Italy. I just put a Trader Joe's sticker on it so you could enjoy the drink without worrying about the price. Her brother grabbed his phone, frantically Googling. He covered his mouth and pointed at me with a shaky finger. Oh my God, you're that Adam. I finished the call. Done. 1.9 billion approved. Thank you, I told the man before he left. Nora stood still, completely shocked by the turn of events. I reached out and held her hand. You defended me all night thinking I had nothing and was no one important. Her eyes looked back at me longingly. Of course I would. I love you. That's when her dad suddenly turned friendly, smiling at me. So, when's the wedding? I raised an eyebrow. I'm sorry, but none of you will be invited. That's when things really started getting out of hand. Her dad's antics became violent the closer we got to the wedding, and her brother started blowing up my phone with texts before we even got to the car. I sat in the passenger seat of Nora's car, hands still shaking, staring at her family's estate through the window. The porch light made everything look fake, like a movie set. Her father's face kept replaying in my mind. That moment when I told him none of them were invited to our wedding. His smile had frozen, then cracked, then twisted into something ugly. I knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of something way bigger and messier than a bad dinner party. Nora squeezed my hand hard, pulling me back to the present. She took a deep breath and turned to face me in the dim car. We needed ground rules before we did anything else about wedding planning. No more flying by the seat of our pants. We talked for almost almost an hour in that car, our voices low and serious. We agreed her family needed to show real change through their actions, not just words. No fake apologies or promises they wouldn't keep. And we weren't setting a wedding date until we saw consistent respect over time, not just one good week. My phone kept buzzing in my lap the whole time we talked. Text after text after text. Her father, her brother, even her mother sent one. I showed each message to Nora without responding to any of them. Half the texts were apologies, half were demands. Her father kept insisting I was being dramatic and that family forgives. Her brother wrote that I was tearing their family apart over nothing. I felt my jaw tighten reading them, but I didn't type back. This boundary needed to hold. The next morning, my father called me before my first meeting. I was in my home office, still in my pajamas, trying to prepare for the day. He'd already heard about the dinner somehow, probably from someone on the board who knew someone who knew Nora's family. He was worried the whole thing might leak to the business press. I felt my frustration building as he talked. He was managing me like a PR problem instead of checking if his son was okay after a terrible night. But I listened to his concerns about optics anyway, because that's what you do when you're about to become chairman. I promised him I had it under control and ended the call faster than I probably should have. At the office, I met with Kenji in my private conference room. He briefed me on how the board had reacted to last night's emergency session. Most of them thought I'd handled the Tokyo deal perfectly under weird circumstances. A few were curious about my personal life but knew better than to ask directly. Kenji walked me through the next steps for closing the deal over the next 2 weeks. Sitting there talking about contracts and international business made me feel steady again. This was a space where my competence wasn't questioned. Nobody cared what I wore or where I shopped or whether I was good enough. I scheduled an afternoon meeting with Haley to talk about media strategy. She came to my office with her laptop and a serious expression. We needed to prepare a statement just in case the dinner story leaked somehow. We spent an hour crafting something short and boring about private family matters. I made it super clear to her that I wanted complete privacy if possible, but I also wanted to be responsible and prepared. Better to have a statement ready than to scramble if some gossip site picked up the story. That evening, Nora met her parents alone at a coffee shop across town. I stayed home, pacing around my condo, checking my phone every 5 minutes. She'd insisted on doing this without me there. She needed to set boundaries as their daughter, not as my defender. When she got back 2 hours later, she looked exhausted. She told them our timeline was ours to control, that their behavior at dinner was completely unacceptable, that apologies needed to come with changed actions over time, not just words in the moment. Her father had cried, her mother had argued, but Nora had held her ground. The next morning, I was in a meeting on the 42nd floor when my assistant knocked on the conference room door. Security was calling from the lobby. Nora's father had shown up unannounced at my office building. He was telling the reception desk he was my future father-in-law and needed to see me urgently. He was playing the victim, saying I was keeping him from his daughter. I felt my space being invaded, my professional life contaminated by this family drama, but I stayed calm. I called security directly and instructed them to ask him to leave the building. He wasn't on any visitor list. He had no appointment. He needed to go. They escorted him out within 10 minutes. I went back to my condo right after work and pulled up the security footage from the lobby on my laptop. I documented everything with timestamps, screenshots of him at the reception desk, video of security walking him out. Then I opened my email and typed out a message to both of Nora's parents. My hands shook as I wrote it, but I felt powerful too. The email was neutral and professional. I was establishing a 30-day no-contact boundary unless we were in a mediated setting with a therapist present. No calls, no texts, no visits, no contact through other people. I attached the security footage as documentation of why this boundary was necessary. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. 2 days later, I was scrolling through Instagram during my lunch break when Nora's brother's story popped up. He'd posted a photo of himself with designer shopping bags, everything carefully arranged. The caption read something about people who buy their way into families they don't belong in. I could see the likes and comments piling up from their family friends, people I'd never met, all agreeing with him, all taking his side. I felt more annoyed than hurt. Honestly, it was so petty and obvious. I showed Nora the screenshot, and we both just shook our heads. I wasn't going to take the bait. Some battles weren't worth fighting. The next morning, I scheduled a video call with Haley to talk about damage control. She pulled up her laptop and showed me the analytics from the social media posts. Nora's brother's story had been screenshotted and shared in a few local gossip groups, but nothing had hit major news yet. Haley suggested we get ahead of it with a simple statement. We drafted something short that focused on my professional background and the charitable foundation work my family does. Nothing about Nora or her family. Nothing defensive or angry. Just facts about my actual accomplishments. We agreed to hold off on any interviews for now. The goal was to keep the focus on my work, not on family drama. That afternoon, I met with Aldo at his law office downtown. He had his assistant bring us coffee while he pulled up the prenup documents on his computer. Aldo explained that he wanted to draft something that protected both Nora and me equally. The usual financial stuff was standard, but he suggested adding specific clauses about boundaries, things like requiring written consent consent before either of our families could access our home, rules about third-party interference in major life decisions, consequences if family members harassed either of us or our future kids. Seeing our values written out in legal language made everything feel more real and safer. I told Aldo to move forward with the draft. 5 days after we sent the boundary email to her parents, their attorney responded. Aldo forwarded me the email with a note that just said, "Brace yourself." I opened the attachment and started reading their proposed prenup. It was clearly designed to punish me. Every clause targeted my assets specifically. There were provisions that would give her family veto power over my business decisions if we had kids. Requirements that I give up my board position if we divorced. Limits on how much of my own money I could spend without her family's approval. I felt my jaw clench as I read through page after page of hostile legal language, but I wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of move I expected from them. I called Aldo and he told me not to engage with the emotion of it. We would counter with our reasonable version and let the lawyers handle the back and forth. My father called me that evening while I was making dinner. He didn't even say hello before launching into his concerns. The board had been asking questions about my personal life. Some members were nervous about headlines mixing business with family drama. He wanted me to consider postponing the wedding until things calmed down, maybe wait 6 months or a year. I stopped chopping vegetables and put down the knife. I told him no. We weren't delaying our lives because of fear about what people might say. Nora and I were moving forward on our own timeline, not the board's timeline. My father tried to argue that it was about protecting the company's reputation. I pushed back harder. There was a long silence on the phone. Finally, he said he understood, but he didn't sound happy about it. Nora came over to my condo that night with takeout and her laptop. We sat on the floor of my living room and started making lists. First, we wrote out our non-negotiables. Things like both families respecting our privacy, no surprise visits, no social media attacks, no contacting our employers or colleagues. Then we created a communication protocol. All family contact would go through email or text, so we had documentation. No more surprise phone calls or doorstep ambushes. We set up consequences too. First violation meant a warning. Second violation meant 30 days no contact. Third violation meant we'd consider legal action. Nora typed everything into a shared document while I organized it into categories. Working through this made me feel like we were actually partners building something together. 2 weeks after the dinner, a delivery person showed up at my office reception desk with a large box. It was the middle of a Tuesday, one of those flat afternoons where I'd already cleared most of my calendar and was working through contract red lines in the quiet of my office. My assistant, Priya, knocked twice and came in holding the box against her hip, looking genuinely confused. She said it hadn't come through our usual courier account, which meant someone had paid to send it directly. She set it on the low table by the window and stepped back like she wasn't sure whether she should stay or leave. The return address was Nora's parents' house. I recognized the street name before I even read the full line, and something in my stomach tightened. I opened it carefully, half expecting something awful. I don't know exactly what I imagined. Some part of me braced for something cruel or theatrical, the kind of gesture designed to make a point. I peeled back the tape slowly and folded open the flaps. Inside, nestled in a bed of pale tissue paper that someone had clearly arranged with care, were 3 hardcover books about etiquette and formal entertaining. The covers were glossy and expensive looking, the kind of books that sit on a shelf and never get opened. One was about hosting dinner parties. One was about proper table settings and the correct placement of every fork and spoon. The third was about correspondence and thank you notes and the etiquette of formal invitations. Under those, folded neatly at the bottom of the box, was a cleaning apron with little hearts printed across it. It was the kind of thing you'd give as a joke, except it wasn't a joke, and everyone involved knew it wasn't. The note attached said something about how these might help me develop some useful skills for the future. The handwriting was careful and precise. Each letter formed the way you learn to write in an expensive school. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. I read it twice, standing there in the middle of my office with the tissue paper still crinkling in my hands. And then I actually laughed out loud. It surprised me, the laugh. It came from somewhere real. It was so petty and obvious that it almost circled back around to being funny. This was a man who owned a vineyard's worth of contempt and had decided the best use of his afternoon was to shop for insult props and pay extra to have them delivered to my place of business. There was something almost impressive about the commitment. Priya looked at me like she wasn't sure whether I was okay, and I told her I was fine, better than fine, and that I'd handle it from here. I took photos of everything for our documentation file. I laid the books out on the table one at a time and photographed each of them next to the note so the connection would be obvious to anyone who ever needed to see it. I photographed the apron. I photographed the return address on the box. I photographed the tissue paper. Aldo had told me weeks ago that the smallest, pettiest things could matter later, that a pattern was built out of details, and I'd taken that to heart. It felt strange to be so methodical about something so childish, but that was the point. I wasn't going to react the way they wanted. I wasn't going to get angry or send back a scorching email or call anyone. I was going to file it calmly into the growing record of exactly who these people were. Then I asked my assistant to donate all of it to the thrift store down the street. I told her to keep keep the box and the note but take the books and the apron and give them to someone who could use them. And she nodded like that was the most reasonable thing she'd heard all day. She actually smiled a little as she gathered everything back up. There was something satisfying about turning an insult into something useful, about letting a stranger get 3 nice books and a perfectly good apron out of a man's attempt to make me feel small. It felt like a quiet kind of win, the kind nobody would ever throw a party over, but the kind that let me breathe a little easier. Later that night, I showed Nora the pictures, and we both just shook our heads. She was curled up on my couch with a blanket over her legs, still in her work clothes, and when the first photo loaded, she made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sigh. She said the apron was a nice touch. She said her father had probably spent more time picking out the tissue paper than he'd ever spent asking her a single real question about her life. I could hear the old hurt under her voice, the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent a lifetime being managed instead of loved. I put my phone down and reached for her hand, and we sat there for a while not saying much. Her father was really committed to this routine. That was the thing that struck me most. Not the cruelty itself, but the sheer stamina of it. The way he kept showing up to a fight nobody else wanted to have. A few days later, Nora's mother sent me a private email asking if we could meet for coffee, just the 2 of us. It came in on a Thursday evening while I was making dinner, and I almost missed it because it landed in the folder where I'd been quietly routing all the family correspondence so I could keep it separate from my work inbox. The subject line just said coffee with a lowercase c and a question mark, which somehow made it feel more human than anything the family had sent so far. The message itself was short. She wrote that she knew she had no right to ask, that she understood if I said no, but that she wanted a chance to talk to me without an audience. There was no demand in it, which was new. There was no accusation. It read like a person testing whether a door was still open, even a crack. I showed Nora the message, and she said it was up to me, but she trusted me to handle it however I wanted. I could tell she had feelings about it that she was deliberately keeping off her face. Her mother had spent years being the one who argued instead of the one who yelled, the one who followed the storm out the door instead of starting it, and that particular flavor of complicity is complicated to sit with. Nora didn't tell me to go, and she didn't tell me not to. She just said she'd support whatever I decided, and then she went quiet in a way that told me she'd already spent a long time thinking about her mother without reaching any conclusions. I told her I'd sleep on it, and I did, and in the morning, I decided to go. Not because I owed her anything, because I was curious what a person sounds like when they're finally scared enough to be honest. I agreed to meet at a quiet cafe across town, somewhere neither of us was likely to be recognized, a small place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and a couple of regulars reading newspapers in the corner. I picked it on purpose. Neutral ground, no home advantage for anyone, no chance of running into someone from her world or mine. I got there 10 minutes early out of habit, wanting to choose where I sat and see her come in rather than the other way around. But when I arrived, her mother was already there, sitting in a corner booth, looking uncomfortable. She'd gotten there before me, which surprised me, and she'd chosen a table tucked away from the window where nobody passing on the street would see her. She had her coat still on even though the cafe was warm. She looked smaller than she had at the estate, out of context, without the marble floors and the staff and her husband's voice filling the room. She ordered us both coffee and then sat there fidgeting with her cup for a minute. She turned the mug around by the handle, first one way, then the other, watching the coffee move instead of looking at me. I let the silence sit. I've learned in business that the person who fills the silence first is usually the one giving something away, and this wasn't a negotiation exactly, but the instinct held. I wrapped my hands around my own cup and waited. She started to say something twice and stopped both times. And finally, she started talking. Her voice was lower than I remembered, without the polished edge she used at dinner parties. She admitted she was scared of losing her daughter to my world and my money. She said it plainly, without dressing it up, and I think saying it out loud cost her something. She talked about watching Nora change over the months we'd been together, about how her daughter had gotten stronger and clearer and less willing to be steered, and about how that terrified her, even though she could see it was good, scared that Nora would move into a life her mother couldn't understand or access. She said she didn't know the language of my world. She didn't know how to talk to people who flew to Tokyo for a meeting and back the same week, people who owned vineyards and shares in grocery chains and pieces of companies she'd never heard of. She said she'd spent her whole marriage learning the rules of one particular room, and now her daughter was walking into a bigger room where none of those rules applied, and she didn't know how to follow, scared of becoming irrelevant to her own kid. That was the one that seemed to hurt her most to say. She got quiet after it, like the word irrelevant had been sitting in her chest for a long time, and she'd finally let it out. I listened without interrupting. It would have been easy to jump in, to argue, to correct the things she got wrong, to point out that money had never been the thing dividing us. But I've found that people rarely tell you the truth twice, and she was telling it to me now, and I didn't want to scare it back down. So I let her talk. I watched her hands and her face, and the way she kept glancing at the door like part of her still expected her husband to walk through it and take over. When she finally ran out of words, she looked down at her cold coffee and waited for me to say something. When she finished, I told her I understood that fear, but I also said that fear didn't excuse the way her family had treated me. I said it gently, because because I did understand it, more than she probably expected. Fear makes people do ugly things. Fear had been driving her husband's whole campaign against me, but understanding where something comes from isn't the same as accepting it, and I wasn't going to let her walk out of that cafe believing that a good explanation was the same as an apology. I told her that being scared of losing her daughter didn't give anyone the right to humiliate me at a dinner table, to throw a gift I'd made by hand next to the trash, to send me props to teach me my place. That respect had to come first before we could build any kind of relationship. Not gestures, not tears in a coffee shop. Actual, consistent respect, shown over time, in the small moments where nobody was watching. She nodded slowly and said she was trying. I believed that she meant it. I also knew, sitting there, that trying and doing were two different countries, and I'd been fooled before by people who confused the two. The following week, we attempted a family dinner at a neutral restaurant. This was Nora's idea, and I'd agreed to it with a lot of hesitation because after everything, sitting across a table from her father again felt like volunteering to touch a stove I already knew was hot. But Nora wanted to give them a structured chance, something small and contained, with clear edges. Everyone had agreed to ground rules beforehand. No personal attacks, no bringing up the past, no social media posting. We'd sent the terms in an email, so there was a record, and her mother had written back confirming them on behalf of the family, which I noted and filed. We'd meet for 1 hour, have a civil meal, and leave. 1 hour. We'd even talked about it as an experiment, a test with a time limit, so that no matter what happened, there was a built-in exit. We chose a restaurant none of us had a history with, a mid-range place with good lighting and enough noise that private conversations stayed private, but not so much that people had to shout. I picked a round table on purpose, thinking a round table might make it harder for anyone to draw sides. Nora and I got there first and sat with our backs to the wall, and I remember reaching under the table and squeezing her knee once, just to say, I'm here, we're doing this together. Nora's parents arrived first. Her father was wearing a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile you put on for a photograph you don't want taken. He shook my hand at the table, briefly, his grip cool and formal, and I made myself meet it evenly. Her mother looked tired. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping, and when her eyes found mine, there was something almost apologetic in them, a small acknowledgement of the coffee we'd shared that neither of us said out loud. Nora's brother came with his wife, and her brother-in-law came too. They filled in the remaining chairs, and for a moment we all just sat there, 6 or 7 people who mostly didn't like each other, pretending to read menus. For the first 20 minutes, everything was painfully polite. It was the kind of politeness that takes more energy than an argument, everyone choosing their words carefully, everyone watching everyone else. People commented on the menu. Her brother's wife asked whether the fish was fresh. Someone mentioned the weather, said it had been unusually warm for the season, and someone else agreed, and for a few seconds the conversation limped along on the safe, dead topics that strangers use in elevators. I answered questions when they were pointed at me, and kept my tone level and pleasant. I complimented the bread. I asked her brother-in-law about his work, and got a careful, guarded answer. It was going, if not well, then at least without incident, and I let myself think for a moment that maybe we'd actually make it the full hour. Then the server tried to seat her father at a spot he apparently didn't like. It was such a small thing. The server came around adjusting chairs, and there was some minor confusion about who was sitting where, and the seat he ended up in was, in his estimation, wrong. Too close to the kitchen or too far from the window or something. I honestly couldn't tell you the real reason, because I'm not sure there was one. He set his napkin down slowly and looked around the table with an expression I recognized from the estate, that gathering stillness right before he decided to make everyone pay for his discomfort. He stood up abruptly and announced he couldn't do this. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, and a couple of people at nearby tables glanced over. He said it again, louder, that he couldn't do this, that we were all being ridiculous, that he refused to be treated like a criminal just for caring about his daughter. He was performing now, playing to the room, casting himself as the wounded father who'd been dragged to a trial he didn't deserve. Nora's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then he grabbed his coat off the back of his chair and walked out of the restaurant, moving fast, not looking back. Her mother hesitated, looked at Nora, then followed him out. Nora and I sat there in stunned silence with her brother and brother-in-law. For a second, nobody moved. The empty chairs where her parents had been sitting still had napkins draped over them, half folded, and the busboy hadn't even cleared their water glasses yet. It had happened so fast that the food we'd ordered hadn't arrived. I looked at Nora and saw her jaw was tight and her eyes were bright, and I put my hand on her back, low, where no one could see it, and just left it there. The server came back looking worried, asking if everything was okay. He clearly thought he'd done something wrong, that he'd caused it somehow with the seating, and I felt bad for him, because he'd just wandered into the middle of a decades-old family weather system and gotten blamed for the rain. Nora told him we'd be staying for dinner anyway. She said it steadily, with a kind of quiet defiance, and I loved her for it. We weren't going to let a man who walked out ruin the meal for the people who'd stayed, so we stayed. And it was strange because with her father gone, the table actually relaxed. Her brother made a dry comment about how at least the food would come faster now, and it was such an unexpectedly human thing to say that I almost laughed. laughed. We ate. We talked, carefully at first, and then a little more easily. It wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't hostile either, and I started to understand something about how this family worked, how much oxygen one person had been taking out of every room he entered. After we ordered, her brother-in-law excused himself to go to the bathroom. He'd been quiet most of the night, quieter than the others, and I'd noticed him watching me a few times with an expression I couldn't read. I waited a few minutes, then followed him out. I'm not sure exactly why I did it. Some instinct told me he had something to say and wouldn't say it inside. In the parking lot, he was standing by his car, looking at his phone. He wasn't texting, just holding it, the screen dark, like he'd taken it out to have something to do with his hands. The evening was cool, and the lot was mostly empty, the light from a single lamppost throwing long shadows across the asphalt. When he saw me, he put it away quickly, sliding it into his jacket like I'd caught him at something. For a moment, we just looked at each other, both of us a little unsure of the rules of this particular conversation. Then he did something I didn't expect. He apologized. It came out fast, like he'd been holding it and was afraid he'd lose his nerve if he slowed down. He said he was sorry about dropping the wine glass on my shirt that first night. He said he'd done it on purpose, that he'd known exactly what he was doing, and that he'd been sick about it ever since. That he'd been mean because Nora's father had threatened to cut him off financially if he was nice to me. He said the words with his eyes down, ashamed of them. That the whole family dynamic was toxic and he felt trapped in it. He told me he'd married into this family thinking he was gaining something, and instead he'd spent years learning to make himself small, to perform the cruelty that kept the peace, to choose his own comfort over doing the right thing again and again. I stood there processing this. The parking lot was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic and the hum of the lamppost above us. Part of me wanted to stay angry. Part of me wanted to tell him that a soaked shirt and a stranger's contempt weren't things you got to hand back with an apology and feel clean again. But another part recognized that he was stuck in the same system that had tried to control me, that the difference between us was mostly that I'd had the resources and the distance to say no, and he hadn't. He was a man who'd traded his spine for a lifestyle, and was only now, standing in a parking lot in the dark, starting to feel the weight of that trade. I told him I appreciated the apology, but that understanding didn't mean I was ready to trust him completely. I wasn't going to pretend one honest moment erased months of quiet participation in something cruel. Trust was going to have to be earned the same way I was asking everyone in that family to earn it, slowly, through actions, over time. He nodded and said that was fair. He didn't argue or try to negotiate a faster forgiveness. He just accepted it, and there was something in that acceptance that made me think maybe he actually meant what he'd said. We walked back inside separately, a few minutes apart, and finished the dinner without ever mentioning it again. The next morning I was getting ready for work when Nora called me from her apartment. I was standing in my bathroom with a razor in my hand, half-dressed, running behind on a morning that already had too much in it. When I saw her name on the screen, I answered right away, and the first thing I noticed was that her voice sounded weird, flat, careful. The voice people use when they're trying to stay calm because they've decided panicking won't help. She told me to check my phone. Not, "Good morning," not, "How did you sleep?" Just, "Check your phone." I put her on speaker and pulled up my browser and saw what she was talking about. Some tabloid had run a story with the headline about gold diggers and wealthy heirs. It was one of those sites that dresses gossip up as reporting, and they'd given it the full treatment. A splashy headline, a breathless first paragraph, a photo. There was an old photo of me in jeans and a sweater standing next to Nora in a gown at some charity event from months ago. I remembered the night the photo was taken. It had been a good night, an easy one, before her family had ever entered the picture. In the image, I looked casual and she looked elegant, and someone had clearly chosen it on purpose, cropping it and framing it to tell a specific story. The article made it sound like I was some poor guy who'd trapped a rich girl. It got the entire dynamic backward, which would have been funny if it hadn't been printed for the whole internet to see. They'd gotten half the facts wrong and invented the other half. They had my name spelled right and almost nothing else. They quoted an unnamed source close to the family, and I didn't have to guess very hard about who that source might be. I felt my hands start shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. I set the razor down on the edge of the sink and gripped the counter for a second and breathed. I told Nora it was going to be okay, and I could hear her wanting to believe me. Then I hung up and went into problem-solving mode, because that was the only thing that ever settled the shaking. I called building security and asked about any unusual activity. The guard on the desk told me there had been photographers outside since early morning, that a couple of them had asked residents whether they knew me, and that a car had been parked across the street for a few hours with someone sitting in it. I walked to my window and looked down at the street, and I saw a car parked across the street that hadn't been there before. Dark, angled so the driver could see my building's entrance. This was getting bigger than I'd expected. This wasn't a bad dinner or a box of insulting books anymore. This was the story leaking out of the family and into the world, and once a story is loose, it's a much harder thing to hold. Haley met me at a coffee shop 3 blocks from my building where the photographers wouldn't think to look. She'd suggested it herself when I called her, telling me not to leave through the front, to use the parking garage and walk the long way around, and I'd done exactly what she said. By the time I got there, she already had a table in the back and 2 coffees waiting, and she'd been working the problem since before I'd even finished my first call to security. She had her laptop open with a full media analysis spread across the screen. She'd built it fast, the way she always did, tracking where the story had started and where it was traveling. The tabloid story had been picked up by 2 smaller outlets and was getting shared on social media, mostly in the kinds of gossip circles that live for exactly this: wealthy people behaving badly, love and money and family betrayal all mixed together. She showed me the numbers without flinching, because Haley never softened things, and I appreciated that about her more than I could say. She walked me through her plan for a controlled narrative reset. She said the worst thing we could do was panic or overcorrect, that a big defensive statement would only pour fuel on it, would signal that the story had gotten to me. Instead, she wanted to do one thing cleanly and let it stand. We would do one written interview with a respected business publication that focused on my actual work history and the philanthropic projects my family's foundation supported. She'd already reached out to an editor she trusted, someone serious, someone whose byline carried weight. The interview would be substantive and dry, all about the Tokyo deal and the transition to chairman and the education initiatives the foundation funded. No photos of me and Nora together, no personal details about our relationship, just my professional track record and the work I actually cared about. The idea was to change the subject by being more interesting than the gossip, to give the real reporters something true and solid to write about, so the false version had less room to breathe. I felt exposed agreeing to put myself out there like this. My whole instinct, my father's instinct too, had always been to stay out of the press, to let the work speak and keep the person behind it private. Doing an interview, even a careful one, felt like stepping into a light I'd spent years avoiding. But Haley was right that staying silent would let other people fill in the story however they wanted. Silence wasn't neutrality. Silence was just an empty page that someone else would write on, and the people writing on it right now did not have my interests at heart, so I agreed. We spent another hour there, going over talking points and reviewing the publication's reputation, and by the time I left, I felt less like a target and more like someone with a plan. The next morning, I had my regular board check-in meeting scheduled. I walked into the conference room and immediately felt the tension. It was in the way people were sitting. A little too upright, a little too quiet, coffee cups untouched in front of them. Word travels fast in a building like ours, and everyone had seen the story or heard about it by now. Our stock had dropped 2% overnight. Nothing major, the kind of movement that happens for 100 reasons on any given day, but the timing made it feel connected, and a couple of the more nervous board members clearly wanted to talk about it. I took my seat at the head of the table and kept my face calm and open, because I've learned that a room takes its temperature from whoever's running it, and if I looked rattled, they'd panic. Kenji stood up and pulled up a presentation showing the press coverage and its limited impact on our actual business operations. He didn't have to. It wasn't on the official agenda, but he'd built it anyway, quietly, the night before, without me asking, and that told me everything I needed to know about the kind of partner he was. He walked the room through it point by point, calm and thorough, separating the noise from the numbers. He'd already spoken with our Tokyo counterparties, who told him they didn't care about American tabloid drama. He'd called them personally, first thing, gotten ahead of any questions, and they'd essentially laughed it off. They were focused on our quarterly projections and the deal we just closed. He showed the fundamentals, the pipeline, the closed contract, the projections, all of it exactly where it should be, and slowly I watched the tension leak out of the room. By the end of his presentation, the other board members looked visibly relieved. One of them even joked that maybe the press attention would help our name recognition, and a few people actually laughed, and just like that, the meeting moved on to the real business. I felt grateful for Kenji's steady presence, and I made a note to tell him so directly, because that kind of loyalty deserves to be said out loud. That afternoon, we had our company all-hands meeting. I stood in front of 300 employees and talked about my transition to chairman and what that meant for the company's direction. Then I addressed the elephant in the room. I told everyone that some personal matters had gotten media attention recently, and I wanted to set clear boundaries. If any reporters contacted them asking about me, they should forward those requests to our communications team and not engage directly. I emphasized that I valued their privacy too, and wouldn't let my personal life create problems for them at work. Several people nodded, and a few came up afterward to say they appreciated the transparency. The next day, Kenji knocked on my office door looking concerned. He showed me his phone where Nora's father had left comments on our company's public LinkedIn page. He'd also sent connection requests to 3 of our vendors and 1 junior employee in our marketing department. The messages were vague, but clearly fishing for information about me. Kenji had already contacted our legal counsel, who drafted a formal cease and desist letter. We sent it that afternoon through our attorney with copies to his attorney. The letter made clear that any further contact with our employees or business partners would be considered harassment, and we would pursue legal action. I felt protective of my team and angry that he was dragging my workplace into his personal vendetta. That evening, Nora called me from her apartment. Her voice sounded flat and tired. Her mother had just informed her that her trust fund access was being cut off immediately. The stated reason was that Nora had chosen me over her family and needed to learn learn the consequences of that choice. Nora told me she'd already started sending out resumes and had 2 interviews lined up for next week. I drove over to her place, and we sat at her kitchen table with our laptops open. We built a realistic budget based on her likely salary range and my current income. I offered to cover more of our shared expenses, but Nora wanted to contribute equally. I felt proud watching her handle this with such maturity. She wasn't panicking or running back to her family. She was building her own independence. 2 days later, I met with Aldo to review the latest prenup draft. He'd incorporated all our feedback about financial independence and added specific clauses about third-party interference. There was language protecting both of us from family members trying to access our finances or make demands on our marriage. The document spelled out that we each maintained separate accounts and decision-making power over our own assets. Reading through it, I felt cautious optimism building. The legal paperwork was actually reflecting our shared values instead of just protecting wealth. That weekend, Nora and I sat in my living room, surrounded by wedding planning materials. We'd originally imagined a ceremony with 150 guests at a historic venue downtown. Looking at everything spread out in front of us, we both felt overwhelmed. Nora suggested we scale way back. What if we did something small and private instead? Just close friends and the family members who actually supported us. I felt immediate relief wash over me. A smaller ceremony meant less pressure, less expense, and way less drama. We started making a new list of maybe 30 people we truly wanted there. The next Tuesday, we went to a small bakery for a cake tasting appointment. We'd specifically chosen a place off the beaten path where we thought we could just be a normal couple picking out dessert. The owner brought out 6 different samples, and we were laughing about the weirdly specific flavor combinations. When the door opened, Nora's father walked in wearing sunglasses and a tense expression. He pulled off the sunglasses and stared at me. He started talking about how I'd stolen his daughter and ruined his family. I stood up and told Nora we should leave. That's when he moved toward me quickly and shoved me hard with both hands. I stumbled backward into a display table covered in sample cakes. The whole thing crashed to the floor and I landed on my side. Pain shot through my arm where it hit the table edge. Nora immediately pulled out her phone and called security while helping me up. The bakery owner was already on her phone calling the police. I pulled up my sleeve and saw a dark bruise already forming on my forearm. I took several photos with my phone, making sure the timestamp was visible. My hands were shaking, but I made myself document everything clearly. We drove straight to the police station. An officer took us to a private room where I gave a detailed statement about what happened. I showed him the photos of my bruise, and the bakery owner had already sent over security camera footage. The officer asked if I wanted to press charges. I told him I wanted a formal incident report filed, but I wasn't requesting an arrest at this time. I wanted documentation and a clear record of the escalating behavior. He printed out a copy of the report and gave me a case number. Walking out of the station, I felt shaken, but also strangely calm. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was documented assault with legal records. The next morning, Nora called her parents' attorney and dictated an ultimatum. Her father needed to enter mandatory therapy immediately. Both her parents needed to provide written apologies that specifically acknowledged the harm they'd caused. They needed to follow all the boundaries we'd set without exception. If they couldn't do these things, Nora was choosing no contact indefinitely. The attorney said he'd relay the message. Nora hung up, and I saw how much the call had cost her. I was proud of her for setting these terms, but I was also scared. I didn't know if her family would actually follow through or if they'd just escalate further. 2 days later, an email appeared in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Family Counseling Arrangements." I opened it and saw Nora's mother had written a short message saying she'd contacted 3 licensed family therapists and wanted to schedule sessions. She listed their credentials and availability. She wrote that she understood trust needed to be rebuilt through actions, and she was committed to doing the work. I read it twice, then forwarded it to Nora without adding any comments. My chest felt tight with something between hope and suspicion. Words on a screen were easy. Showing up week after week was different. We agreed to pick the therapist with the most experience in high-conflict family dynamics and scheduled our first session for the following week. The therapy office had beige walls and comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. Nora's father arrived 10 minutes late, wearing sunglasses he didn't take off until the therapist asked him to. The therapist introduced herself and explained the ground rules about respect and taking turns speaking. Nora's father sat with his arms crossed and barely made eye contact. The therapist asked him to share what brought him to counseling. He talked for 20 minutes about his own childhood in a wealthy family where status meant everything. He described his mother's obsession with maintaining appearances and how he learned that losing social standing was worse than anything. His voice cracked when he talked about his fear that Nora choosing me meant he'd failed as a father. I sat there listening and felt unexpected sympathy mixed with anger. Understanding where his behavior came from didn't erase what he'd done. When it was my turn, I pulled out my phone and showed photos of the bruise on my arm. I described the bakery incident in specific detail. I listed other examples of harassment and boundary violations. The therapist took notes and asked Nora's father if he understood the harm he'd caused. He nodded slowly and and said he'd been trying to protect his daughter, but realized he'd gone too far. I stated my boundaries clearly for future contact. No unannounced visits, no contacting my workplace, no social media posts about me. Communication only through Nora or the therapist until further notice. He agreed verbally, and the therapist documented everything. 3 days after the session, Nora got a call from her brother. She put him on speaker while we sat in my living room. He told her he'd deleted all his Instagram posts about me and our relationship. His voice sounded different, less sharp. He said he'd been applying to jobs outside the family business and had 2 interviews scheduled. He admitted he'd been financially dependent on their parents his whole adult life, and it made him feel trapped. He apologized for the things he'd said at dinner and online. Nora thanked him and told him she was proud of him for making changes. After she hung up, I felt relief, but also doubt. People could delete posts easily. Following through on actually taking a job that paid less was harder. The following week, I stood at a community center in a lower-income neighborhood for a foundation event focused on educational access. We'd partnered with local schools to provide free tutoring and college prep resources. I spent 3 hours talking with students and parents, helping set up computer stations and explaining scholarship opportunities. Haley stood near the back monitoring her phone and tracking social media mentions. Later, she showed me the analytics. The event had gotten positive local news coverage and supportive comments. The narrative was shifting from wealthy person drama to actual community work. Standing there, surrounded by kids excited about learning opportunities, made me feel grounded again. 2 days later, my father asked me to meet him at his office downtown. He closed the door and we sat across from each other at the conference table. He pulled out a folder with transition documents and a proposed media plan. He asked my input on timing and messaging. We spent an hour going through details about the chairman role, board responsibilities, and how to announce it without exploiting my personal situation for publicity. He listened when I said I wanted the focus on business strategy and company values, not on my relationship drama. He agreed and made notes. For the first time in months, I felt like he was seeing me as a professional partner instead of a PR problem. The next Saturday evening, I hosted a small gathering at a private room in a quiet restaurant. My side of the family came along with Kenji and Haley. Nora arrived looking nervous, but my aunt immediately pulled her into conversation about her work. My father shook her hand and asked genuine questions about her career plans. Kenji talked with her about industry trends. Haley told funny stories from past PR disasters she'd managed. The whole evening felt calm and supportive. No one interrogated Nora or made snide comments. I watched Nora relax and laugh at my aunt's jokes. She fit naturally into my world when people treated her with basic respect. Walking out that night, I felt like I could finally breathe a little. At 11:30 that same night, my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. I almost didn't listen, but something made me check. Nora's father's voice came through angry and slurred. He said the therapy was ridiculous and that I was poisoning his daughter against her family. He called me manipulative and accused me of using money to control Nora. The message went on for 2 minutes with escalating accusations. I saved it and sent a copy to the therapist. Nora and I had already agreed on our boundary. No contact outside of therapy until he completed his initial sessions and showed consistent change. I felt tempted to call him back, but reacting emotionally would only feed the conflict. Instead, I turned off my phone and went to bed. The following week, Aldo called and asked Nora and me to come to his office. He had the final prenup documents printed and ready for signatures. We sat together reading through each section. The agreement protected both of us financially and included specific clauses about boundaries against family interference in our marriage. It stated that neither family could make financial claims against us or use money to manipulate our relationship. Nora picked up the pen and signed without any hesitation or questions. She didn't ask for changes or try to negotiate softer terms. Watching her commit to our partnership on paper made something settle in my chest. That evening at my apartment, Nora and I sat at the kitchen table with notebooks and started the difficult conversation about her family and the wedding. I wanted our ceremony to be peaceful and focused on us, but completely excluding her family felt harsh if they were genuinely trying to change. We went back and forth for an hour. Nora said her mother had been consistent with therapy and making real effort. Her father was more complicated. I pulled out a legal pad and started writing conditions. They would need to complete a minimum number of therapy sessions. They would need to provide written apologies that acknowledged specific harmful actions. They would need to follow all our stated boundaries for at least 2 months without violation. They could attend the ceremony only, not the reception. They would have no speaking role. Security would be present. Nora read my list and nodded, adding that any violation would result in immediate removal. 3 weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at my office in a formal envelope. Nora's mother had written 4 pages acknowledging her enabling behavior and listing specific examples of harm she'd witnessed and failed to stop. She apologized for prioritizing family image over my dignity and safety. She explained the work she was doing in counseling to understand her patterns and make different choices. The letter felt sincere and specific, not generic. That same afternoon, Nora received an email from her father. The message was brief and typed. He wrote that he may have overreacted to our relationship and that he was working on managing his emotions better. The apology apology felt minimal compared to everything that had happened, but it was more than I'd expected from him. We scheduled the mediated meeting for the following Thursday at the therapist's office. Both families would attend to discuss ceremony boundaries. I spent 2 days preparing a written document outlining specific rules, including sobriety requirements, no unplanned interactions with me, designated seating arrangements, and a clear timeline for arrival and departure. The morning of the meeting, we arrived early and sat in the waiting room reviewing our notes one last time. Her parents came in separately, her mother first and her father 10 minutes later. My parents arrived right on time with calm, neutral expressions. The therapist led us into a conference room and asked everyone to sit. I pulled out my printed document and slid copies across to everyone. I went through each boundary point by point. The ceremony would be alcohol-free for all guests. Her family could attend the ceremony only, not the reception. They would sit in designated seats away from my family. No speeches or toasts from anyone. Security would be present and had authority to remove anyone causing disruption. Her father shifted in his seat and opened his mouth to object, but her mother put her hand on his arm. Nora spoke up and reinforced that these weren't negotiable terms. Her father's jaw tightened, but he nodded stiffly. Her brother wasn't present, but had sent word through their mother that he accepted all terms. After 2 hours of discussion, we reached a formal agreement. Her mother signed the document the therapist had prepared. Her father signed too, but his hand shook slightly, and I couldn't tell if it was anger or nerves. Nora and I both signed, then my parents signed as witnesses. Wedding week arrived faster than I expected. Haley worked quietly behind the scenes, fielding media inquiries and keeping our venue location completely private. A few photographers tried following us, but our security team redirected them. On Wednesday afternoon, Nora got a call from a firm she'd interviewed with 3 weeks earlier. She stepped into the bedroom to take it and came out 10 minutes later with a huge smile. They'd offered her a senior analyst position with a salary she'd earned entirely on her own merit. She accepted right there on the phone. Nora had been anxious about feeling dependent on my wealth, so having her own income mattered deeply to her. Seeing her this proud and settled made me more confident about our future together. Friday afternoon, we held a short rehearsal at the venue with just the officiant, the photographer, and key participants. Her father arrived exactly on time, wearing a navy suit and sunglasses despite being indoors. He removed them when the therapist reminded him about the agreed protocols. We walked through the ceremony sequence twice. The second time through, her father made a comment about the simple flowers, calling them quaint in a tone that wasn't quite a compliment. I felt my shoulders tense, but I stayed calm. Security stepped forward and did a verbal intervention exactly as we'd planned, reminding him about respectful behavior. Her father pressed his lips together and nodded. Her mother apologized quietly to Nora. We finished the rehearsal without further incident. The morning of our wedding, I woke up at 6 and couldn't fall back asleep. I ordered coffee and sat by the window watching the city wake up. Around 7:30, I heard paper sliding under my door. I got up and found a small envelope with my name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a family recipe card for apple cinnamon bread and a brief note from her father. The note said he understood the boundaries we'd set and would keep his distance today. He hoped we'd be happy. The recipe card had stains and worn edges like it had been used many times. Something in my chest softened slightly. I wasn't letting my guard down completely, but I appreciated the gesture. I tucked the card into my bag and got ready. My parents arrived at 9 sharp to help me get ready. I put on my simple charcoal suit and looked at myself in the mirror. I felt ready. The ceremony proceeded quietly in our small venue with about 30 guests total. Her parents sat on opposite sides of the aisle and away from my family as planned. Her father wore a dark suit and kept his hands folded in his lap. Her mother sat perfectly still with her purse on her knees. Security stood at the entrances but stayed unobtrusive. The therapist sat in the back corner with her notebook. When the officiant signaled, I walked down the short aisle alone by choice. Nora stood at the front, looking nervous and happy. The ceremony lasted 28 minutes. When the officiant pronounced us married, Nora kissed me gently, and I heard quiet applause. We turned to face our guests, and I saw her father dabbing his eyes with a tissue while her mother smiled. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Our vows emphasized partnership, autonomy, and the concept of chosen family. Nora spoke first about building a life based on mutual respect and supporting each other's independence. I talked about choosing each other every day and creating our own definition of family. The words felt deeply true coming out of my mouth. I got slightly teary speaking about trust and boundaries, about love that protects rather than controls. Nora squeezed my hands when I finished, and I saw her eyes were wet too. We signed the marriage certificate with our parents as witnesses. Then we moved outside for photos. The photographer took family photos quickly, starting with my side, then her side, then one photo with everyone together. Her family left on schedule without drama, her mother shaking Nora's hand and her father giving a brief awkward hug. They walked to their cars and drove away. The relief I felt when they were gone was huge. Our private dinner reception with a small circle of close friends and family felt warm and relaxed. 20 guests total, including my parents, Nora's brother-in-law, who'd apologized privately, and several colleagues who'd become friends. Kenji gave a toast about sustainable leadership, and and authentic relationships, talking about how the strongest partnerships are built on mutual respect and clear communication. He raised his glass and everyone joined in. We ate good food, told stories, and laughed without worrying about drama or judgment. Nora held my hand under the table, and I felt genuinely happy. That night, Nora and I sat on the balcony of my condo with glasses of wine, watching the city lights flicker on below us. I thought about how far we'd come from that awful dinner where her family treated me like I wasn't good enough, how we'd gotten married despite everything, how we were both working in jobs we'd earned on our own merit. We had boundaries that finally held. Her father had slipped a worn recipe card under my door instead of a threat. Nora reached over and laced her fingers through mine, and I realized the shaking in my hands was gone for the first time in months. Sitting there next to my wife in the quiet evening air, I didn't need them to bow or beg or admit a single thing out loud. They already knew. That was enough. That was everything.